Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 753 lecture. We'll be talking about file formats this week. So here are our weekly topics. Which factors determine a file format's utility for digital preservation? Which or what risks? I can never remember which one to use. Can file formats pose for digital preservation efforts? How can archives address those risks? And how can archives influence the file formats that they receive? Okay, so we'll start by talking about the nature of records a little bit. So file formats are created in a particular format by a particular piece of software or particular software. And that results in records having particular significant properties. And these significant properties can be vital to the research value of records or the preservation of these significant characteristics more specifically. So if these preservation or if these significant properties are changed over time due to bit rot or due to preservation actions that archivists take, then that may make the records less useful for researchers. So let's jump out of the slideshow here and take a quick look at a preservation action plan that the National Archives has for digital still images, also known as raster images. So they have a nice definition of what digital still images are. And then they talk about the essential characteristics, you could call them significant properties, of a digital still image. So they talk about preserving the structural, technical, and descriptive metadata. So that's important. And we'll kind of go through some of the different breakdowns of the significant characteristics that they have. So they start with the appearance. So looking at the size of the file, the size of the image, the color can be an important one for a digital image. So if the colors change because of migration or something like that, then that would be a significant property that is impacted. And that can, again, make the record less valuable for researchers because the record is less authentic. The bit depth, so records that have high bit depth will have more accurate colors, more accurate gradients, more tonal information. So again, just a more authentic version of the record. And then the orientation, so portrait versus landscape. And then as I mentioned before, they also talk about some of the documentation of the record. So wanting to have technical metadata that describes the layout of the record. So the file format, compression, resolution, bit depth, EXIF information. So it really goes back to the idea that we've talked about in this course of preserving not only the content of the record, but context as well in the form, at least partially, of metadata attached to records. They talk about the display and how the record displays as being an important characteristic. And then we have some more metadata. So having technical metadata that describes the contents of the record, context of the record, having descriptive metadata that describes the context of the record. So again, all of these things are going to be shaped by the file format of the record and what was used to create the file. So if a record is created as a TIFF, then the colors might be represented in a particular way. The bit depth will be higher because it's a higher quality image. So there really is a strong connection between these essential characteristics and the format that records are created on. So that's one thing that archivists need to when to think about when thinking about the file format. Another issue that archivists have to deal with is just the complexity of files and file formats. So file formats can have different extensions. So in the NARA article for this week, they talk about having 18 different types of PDF files. And these change over time. And so how content is represented in one type of PDF may not be the same if it is represented in another type of PDF. And archives may prefer to receive and preserve a type of PDF that is more stable and is able to represent a variety of different types of PDF file extensions in a more authentic manner. Another thing about file formats, which we've kind of touched on in this course, is that some are easier to preserve over time. And I'm including providing access to records, which, as we've talked about, is really the key part of preservation. So for certain file formats, it's really easy to receive them from a donor, make a few copies, and allow researchers to access those copies. For other file formats, it can be a lot more difficult. It may be that archives need additional software or additional tools to make that access happen. This might be especially true with more complex formats such as databases. I guess that should be one word. And these complex files may require more resources to preserve and to provide access to. And there are a lot of different file formats out there. So in the NARA article, they talk about how NARA has over 2 billion files and 350 file formats that they've identified. So just the sheer number of file formats that exist and different extensions for these different file formats can lead to, again, a lot of complexity when it comes to determining the best way to preserve and provide access to the different records that are in an archive. So what are some of the factors that make particular file formats more threatening or more difficult to preserve over time than others? One is if file formats are proprietary, so if they were created by a specific company, and that can be risky because if that company runs or goes out of business and it's no longer supporting the file format and it's no longer providing tools or specific software that are required to render information on a file format, then that can make it more difficult for archives to provide access to that record. If file formats are older, it can be more difficult for archives to provide access to them as well. It may be that over time, the tools used to render these file formats no longer exist or haven't been updated in some time. The tools may be scarce. It may take a level of expertise to use tools required to render older file formats that archives may not necessarily possess. And that can be a threat to ultimately providing access to the records. Another complication can be if file formats are poorly documented, if there just isn't a lot of information about a particular file format, then that can make it difficult for archivists to understand, how the file format is structured, what kind of record it's for. A lack of information can make it more difficult for archives to develop tools that can be used to access the records, or for other people to develop tools to access records. So that can be problematic. Just records that are sort of poorly understood and poorly documented. Another complication can be if records are uncommon. So if only a few people, relatively speaking, use records that are in a particular file format, then there may not be a broad section of knowledge about what the file format is, about how to access the file format. It may be less likely that the file format has tools that can be used to access the information on a particular record. And that's going to be to a large extent because if only a few people are using something, then it's likely that there's going to be less interest from people kind of outside of that group to develop tools to access records in a file format that they have no sort of connection to or no involvement with. So if my company is the only company that uses records in file format X, then there's not necessarily going to be a lot of interest in people outside of our company to develop tools, especially open source tools, to access those records, simply because they're just uncommon, and there really isn't a groundswell of interest and support in developing tools that are widely available that people can use to access those records. So another complication can be, as I've sort of touched on, a lack of tools, especially open source tools. So if there aren't tools that archives can use that are inexpensive and fairly straightforward to use, then that can be a complicating factor as well. One thing that was interesting about the Rosenthal article is that the author argued that it's very uncommon for file formats to truly become obsolete. So to truly get to the point where there is no tool or no piece of software that can be used to access information in records in a file format. And he talks about how web browsers and mature markets and other things result in the creation of tools that in one form or other can provide access to records. And that makes a lot of sense. I don't think that the real risk for archives is obsolescence, but rather the difficulty and resources that it can require to provide access to records in a particular format. So even if it's technically possible to access information contained in a record that is in a particular file format, archives may not have the expertise or the funds or the time to figure out how to do that. Archives may not be able to, acquire or be able to use the magic key that unlocks a record in a particular file format and provide that information to researchers in whatever form. So obsolescence may be uncommon, but the reality is that archives only have a finite amount of resources to do things, and that may result in records that can technically be accessed as being essentially inaccessible. Again, just because archivists don't have the resources to use whatever tool is needed to provide access to an obscure file format from like 30 years ago. That's just the reality of the situation. Rosenthal seems pretty dismissive of file formats that are in obscure or records that are in obscure file formats. I don't know. I think that there probably is a lot of really interesting and useful information on old file formats. So I don't think that just because something is necessarily obscure or necessarily uncommon, that doesn't mean that archives should just ignore it and say, okay, well, we're not gonna worry about this. If the records document an important person or organization, if the records document an important context of an organization's activities or a person's life, then it may be worth it for archives to make the investment in accessing records that are in file formats that are difficult to work with. Hopefully there's pretty good justification for that, but sometimes it's still worth the effort. So I don't really think that Rosenthal made a valid point where he's like, well, we shouldn't really worry about these because it's probably not important. I mean, he does give solutions for it if archivists want to access records, but he's sort of initially dismissive of the idea that these records could contain any useful information at all, which I don't think is true. Rosenthal is also pretty dismissive of the idea of using tools like Droid, which we see here, to sort of screen records as they come into the repository. He basically says it's a waste of time. He kind of argues that the information that these tools create is inaccurate. That article was written in 2010, so I assume that tools have kind of improved over time. But he really sort of poo-poos the idea of looking at file formats in the first place. And he says that it can lead to archivists just seeing a file that looks like it might be problematic and saying, okay, well, we're not going to worry about this. We're going to get rid of this. And he feels that this might ultimately be harmful to, the amount of information that's out there for the public to use. I don't know that that's necessarily something that archivists would do. So here I have a screenshot from a Droid report that I did on just sort of a random record set that I put together. And you can see that there are a few files on here that Droid can identify. It doesn't have a format in its format directory that corresponds with these records. So looking at this MX8 record, this record is in a file format created by a piece of software used for music production. So it's proprietary, it's probably not terribly common. It's not older, although there are newer versions of this particular piece of software. So, it definitely fits some of, there's probably not a ton of documentation out there about it. It doesn't have an entry in the registry that Droid uses to identify file formats. So in a lot of ways, it is kind of a threatening, troublesome file format for archivists to work with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should get rid of it. It means you should think carefully about whether you should bring it into your archive. It means that you should think about the type of resources that you would have to use to provide access to it, especially in its most authentic form. You should think about the overall value of the record and if it documents an aspect of a person's life or an organization's business that is really important to document. You should think if it might be easier in the future to provide access to these records. I don't think it's really the archival position to sort of default to, okay, well, we're going to get rid of this, which is seems to be a concern of Rosenthal's. So that was another part of that article that I didn't particularly vibe with in the parlance over times. A great thing about tools like Droid is that they can say, all these files are most of these files are fairly common. Here are a few that you might want to be aware of and you might want to think about, where they fit into your archive. So Droid doesn't say, okay, wow, you really need to get rid of this. It says, this is here. You should think about if you want it. You should think about what you want to do with it and just kind of go from there. So I kind of thought that Rosenthal was maybe being a bit of a pessimist about how archives might respond to seeing this type of information in a report from a tool like Droid, which does screen records and identify formats and provide some other useful information for archivists to use in the future. So when archivists are looking at file formats and thinking about file formats, there are a few things that they really need to do. And conveniently enough, I have them listed here. So first of all, they need to be able to document file formats. And that was something that the NARA article talked about how they get varying levels of information about records that are coming in from the agencies and departments that provide records to NARA. So some file format information is really granular, some of it is less detailed, and so that's kind of a complication with being able to identify and document the file formats that are within NARA's holdings. But it's just a really good idea to know what you have in your archives and to know which file formats might be particularly problematic and which ones you kind of need to keep an eye on and think about how you're going to provide access to them. So just knowing what you have is pretty important. Another thing that archives need is the ability to influence the file formats that are coming into their repository. So NARA talks about how their preservation guidelines for file formats is its guidance. They can't say you have to do this. They can say we would like for you to do this, but there really isn't much of a stick that NARA can hold over the heads of the different agencies and departments that provide records to NARA. One really helpful thing for archives would be the ability to influence the types of file formats that are created and the types of file formats that are being used by potential donors. So if you're really able to nip things in the bud and say, we would really like for you to create and use records in these file formats because it'll be easy for us in the future, that would just be so helpful. You wouldn't have to worry about file formats coming in that weren't ones that you had identified as being preferable or acceptable. Obviously, archives need to be able to preserve file formats that are coming into a repository. If you're not able to provide access to records because they're in a file format that you can't access information from, then why do you have the records? You're just wasting server space with records that that you can't necessarily provide access to. So as I talked about earlier, sometimes that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you can sit on records and say, okay, well, we can access these now, but maybe we can access these in the future. But that's not something that you really want to invest in too much, because again, you are taking up storage space with records that you can't provide access to. You're sort of muddying the waters as far as what researchers look at and what researchers have to work with. So it's something that's probably fine in limited doses, but ideally you are able to preserve everything that comes into your repository. Another thing that archives need to do is to monitor emerging threats, and that's something that the NARA article talked about as well. Archivists need to be aware of what kind of file formats are out there, what kind of file formats your potential donors are creating and using records in that might be troublesome in the future. And again, you can either try and work with your donors to make sure that they aren't creating and using records in those file formats. If you know about some emerging threats, you can be able to think about how are we going to provide access to these records when they come into our repository in the future. You might start thinking about, what kind of tools you might use, so you can be proactive in that way. But it's just good to be proactive and aware of what's going on out there and what potential problems you might have coming down the road. A really important thing that the NARA article talked about is the importance of documentation and communication. So the article talked about how what they were creating was essentially a documentation of preservation intent. They were creating file format-based preservation commitments given the organizational capabilities and requirements of collections. So they were communicating, here's what we are going to do when it comes to digital preservation, and they were being really transparent about that and providing documentation for people to look at so they can understand why NARA made the decisions that they made. They can understand how NARA weighed the different risks that the file formats can have, things like old age, proprietary nature, and so on. And they said, and here's why we prefer this file format and not this file format. One really helpful thing that NARA did, I think, is they had a lot of communication and collaboration with partner agencies. So working with them to identify file formats that might be problematic and including them in the discussion over which file formats were preferred and acceptable. There was a lot of communication with subject matter experts about possible alternatives to certain formats. So getting people who are likely to use these records involved with these discussions. There was an open comment period where the public was able to provide NARA with their perspective about different file formats, and it seems like that was a helpful thing. It seems like it provided some new things for NARA to consider. So it seemed like this really was a pretty collaborative process. And if you go through this collaborative process and you document your decisions, that just puts you in a much better position to say, you know, here's why we made the decisions that we made. And that's certainly more defensible than, well, you know, we just kind of, you know, threw a dart at a bunch of file formats and, you know, these were the ones that we chose. The more you can sort of show your work, and the more you can show that your work included a lot of collaboration and input from multiple people and multiple perspectives, the better off you're able to be. And so you might include this, this documentation of acceptable and preferred and I guess less preferred file formats and your sort of overall digital preservation workflow and digital preservation documentation. And communicating what you want can be really helpful too. And that's why I had us take a look at some file format guidance from the Smithsonian Institution, from the University of Michigan, and from the University of Minnesota, because they all say, you know, here's what we prefer. If you give us this, here's what we can do with your records. You know, if you give us this, then we're not going to be able to preserve these records as authentically. And they're just really pretty open with the public about what they were doing and why they were doing it, and what the public can expect and what donors can expect if they give certain records to these archives. So again, communication, transparency, documentation can be a really strong and beneficial support to have when it comes to really all manner of digital preservation, but especially in this instance, developing and communicating file format preferences and standards. One reason why it's beneficial for archives to, in some ways, limit the file formats that are coming into the repository by saying, you know, these are what we prefer, you know, these are acceptable, these are the ones that we don't really want, is that it can lessen the need for preservation actions that may be required to provide access to the record. So if you have records that you don't really need to migrate before you provide access to them to researchers, then that's really beneficial, because it can lessen the chances that what the researcher sees is going to be less authentic than the original record. So it's much beneficial to go from a TIFF to a JPEG, where the changes will be, you know, not as substantial, to going from some obscure digital image file format to a JPEG, which might result in some pretty significant changes to the record. So the overall goal is to just reduce the changes to the record as much as possible. And if you're asking what impact does migration have, you know, it can result in the loss of a lot of information. So for instance, if you have a PSD file, so a PlayStation, or I'm sorry, PlayStation, a Photoshop file that has a lot of information here that really shows how this particular image was created, how all the different aspects of this record were developed and layered and put together. That can be really great information for researchers to have, and it can be an important resource for researchers, especially if the person that created this record is maybe a highly regarded artist or an important person in the artistic world. This information can be a really significant and valuable source of information. If you take this and you migrate it, and all the researcher has to look at is the content of the record and maybe some metadata, but you lose all the details of how this image is composed and how it's put together. And so if you're thinking about what is the impact of migration, that can be one of those impacts. It can result in a loss of information. And that's just something that every archive should be aware of, is what is going to happen if we change this file format to another file format. And you could either say, we're going to try and provide access to this PSD file or the information contained in this PSD file in some way. We're just going to migrate everything to JPEG for access and not really worry about this extra stuff. But you just have to have some awareness of what the results of a migration can be. You also have to think about when would migration take place. When do you migrate things right when they come into your repository if you need to, or what does that look like? How will migration take place? So what tools might you use to migrate records into a different file format? You might ask yourself, are records in the original format preserved as well? If so, that's going to require more storage space. And also, can migration be automated? So if you think of Naura has 2 billion files, okay, so even if you have to migrate a small percentage of those, that's still a ton of migration. And it's not going to be within the capabilities of most archives to be able to do that kind of bit by bit in a non-automated way. So again, a great way to really avoid all these questions in the first place is to just bring in records that are in file formats that you can preserve easily and provide access to easily, and records that either won't need to be migrated or won't need to be migrated for access into the distant future. So again, things that are broadly used, things that have a lot of open source tools already, and records that are just already fairly accessible, and ones that you don't really have to put a lot of effort into making accessible. Okay, so we'll wrap things up by connecting our discussions of file formats this week with some of the aspects of digital preservation that we've discussed in this course already, and also connecting it to some of the other activities that archives engage in. So access, as I stated before, some file formats are kind of inherently more accessible than others. Again, ones that are more commonly used, that aren't proprietary, and so on. And so, these are the ones that archives want to have. These are the ones that are going to be accessible right when they come into the repository, that aren't going to require a lot of migrations and other things that can impact the authenticity of the record, and that just makes it a lot easier for archives to deal with these records. And if archives don't have to put as much effort into providing access to file formats because they are really accessible when they come in, then that's less staff time and less other resources the archives have to devote to making records accessible. So having file formats coming in that are accessible already can result in fewer challenges to authenticity and less resources being devoted to digital preservation, which can increase the sustainability of the archive overall. Again, you want to document which file formats you say you prefer and why, and make sure that that information is available to the public. It's great to have some kind of collaboration with experts in a particular subject, with the public, with your donors to let them know which file formats you prefer and why. So collaboration is a big part of the file format question as well. Storage, obviously you have to store things. So that's not as connected to file formats per se, but it's a part of digital preservation as a whole. Okay, so connections to outreach. The more you conduct outreach and advocacy and the more your donors sort of value you and the more agencies and departments that you might work with value you, the more they're going to listen to you and the more likely they are to create and use and donate records that are easy for you to work with. So if you say, we prefer that you use this type of record in this type of file format, if an agency doesn't really care about archives, they might say, okay, well, we've always used this file format and we don't really think that we're going to change because we don't really care if these records are accessible or not. We just want to do our jobs. If an archives is valued, if an archives is thought of as being a valuable part of an organization, then they might say, then a future donor might say, okay, well, we are interested in helping you out. So we are going to try and shift over to working into in these file formats that you have mentioned. Appraisal, when archives are conducting appraisal, ideally before ingest, they might say, well, a lot of these files are in a file format that is going to be difficult for us to work with, so we really have to think twice about accepting this collection or accepting these records in their current state. So it's definitely something that archives should consider. Again, just trying to determine whether or not the difficulty and complications that certain file formats might cause is equal to the value of the records and the overall need to preserve information contained on records in difficult file formats. Records management, I don't see a ton of connections between that and file formats. Processing, I guess you can list which file formats your records are in on a find aid. So, that might be helpful information for researchers. In a find aid or some other descriptive tool, you might mention if records have been migrated to a different file format and that what a researcher is looking at may not be the most authentic representation of a record. So there may be some connections with processing there. But it's probably more related to outreach and appraisal than these other two that I have listed here. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and call it a day there. The Owens half chapter for this week also has some really good discussions on do file formats go obsolete, and talking about normalization and migration and the importance of documentation. So hopefully that information has been helpful for you in putting the other readings of this for this week in context as well. And yeah, the more archives are able to influence the types of file formats coming into the archives, the easier their life will be down the road. And really, a lot of it just goes down to working with donors as much as possible, even before ingest or during ingest, to limit the instances where archives have to deal with file formats that can be problematic and require more resources. So it just kind of goes back to efficiency. It goes back to outreach, and it goes back to archives to putting themselves in the best position possible to make digital preservation something that can be done at a large scale, and also something that meets the needs of researchers and the expectations of the public and of stakeholders as well. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care.